This morning we are continuing our series that we introduced last week called Sent, and we've alluded to that some this morning. But throughout this series, what we're looking at is what it means to live lives that invite others to find and follow Jesus. And I wanted just to start by sharing a little bit of my own story around this, because this whole idea of sharing our faith with others has been an integral part to my faith. It has created lots of questions for me. It's been an ongoing challenge. But I thought me sharing my story, maybe there was some things that you would identify with and hopefully help you get a sense for what we envision for this, what our intentions are, and what we anticipate this to look like. My journey of faith early on was very deeply connected with evangelism and the call to share our faith with others. The tradition I grew up in saw sharing your faith as a sign of spiritual maturity and strong faith, which it absolutely can be. And so as a high schooler, I very much involved in my youth group, took this very seriously, learning how to share my faith and tools to do that and ways to go about that. And not only that, but integrated it into my life. And so one of the things that I share often is that with my sports teams, if we were having an away game and I was riding back on the bus, and whoever I was sitting with, I was going to share my faith with them. I was going to share my story with them and invite them to follow Jesus. And so I would do this, and sometimes people would make a decision to follow Jesus. They would pray the prayer, and other times they wouldn't, and that happens. That's the way it goes. But one of the things that began to happen that created a little bit of a crisis for me is I would lead people to pray a prayer to receive Jesus, and then the next day it was as if nothing had happened. And I began to wonder, if someone's had a genuine encounter with Christ, you would think that the next day it's not as though nothing had happened. I wouldn't expect immediate life change, but it created this disillusionment with me of what is actually happening in conversion. What happens when somebody prays the prayer, and raising questions of how do we know God, and how do we know that what we know is from God. And so as I went into college then, I found myself as the evangelism team leader for the campus ministry I was a part of while I was having this crisis of faith, which meant, not crisis of faith, but crisis kind of what is this work. In other words, I wasn't very good at my job because I was having this crisis and asking these questions around what is it that we do when we share our faith, and how do we go about this in the right ways. Ultimately, this drove my academic pursuits, asking some of these questions on an academic level of how do we know what we know? How do we know God? How do we share our faith with others? What does it mean for someone to experience conversion? What does it mean for someone to have an encounter with Christ? And so carried many of these questions with me. And yet, in tension with all of this is that I still wanted people to find and follow Jesus. I still want people to find the peace of God's presence in their life and to be free from all of the things that the world tells them that they need in order to have life other than God. The things that we feel this pressure to pursue in order to have satisfaction, to have meaning. These things that I think ultimately we can only find in God, and yet we spend our lives trying to find them in other places. But in the midst of this, I've always been concerned that some of our strategies and our approaches to this may have the short-term gain of people praying the prayer, but the long-term damage of hurting the reputation of Jesus and his people because of the ways that we sometimes go about this work. Maybe you share some of my experience, or maybe not my experience, but some of my concerns. Maybe for you, there's the fear of offending others, that bringing up these conversations might offend them, or the fear of not knowing what to say or how to respond to questions. Maybe it's just the awkwardness of having these conversations, right? Like the first date, like what's okay to say and what's not okay to say, what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask. Maybe it's just the pure awkwardness of it. But what I have come to understand about this work of helping others find and follow Jesus is that it may be difficult to strike up some of these conversations with people that we don't know all that well. To go in with an agenda of where we want the conversation to go and a certain outcome that we are looking for. And what I've learned is I can have hang-ups with all of those things, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's what we're actually being asked to do anyway. I think what we're being asked to do is to think about where we have been placed, locationally, relationally. Who have we been placed in relationship with, and why God might have brought those people into our lives? And then to be the kind of people who express genuine interest and loving curiosity about their lives. I think about the society that we live in, the culture that we live in. There's so much that is demanding our attention and our focus. And so I think it's actually a radically selfless and loving thing to do in our world, to express genuine interest and curiosity in someone else's life. The author of this book, Sent, that Alex introduced us to last week, shares about the power of curiosity and talks about how it is incredibly powerful when it comes to making meaningful connection with other people. And she shares in the book about some of these questions that she will often use to kind of get to know other people better and to spur conversation. And she shares about being in this class and sharing these questions. And one of the questions that she asked the class is, what is one thing that you wish people would ask you about yourself? What is one thing that you wish people would ask you about yourself? And people just jumped at this with all kinds of unexpected responses. But one of the stories that she shares is this basketball player who is well known in their school. He's a star athlete. And his response is, people always ask me about basketball. I wish people would stop asking me about basketball. I wish people would ask me about this video game that I am really stinking good at. And somebody else pipes up and they're like, my boyfriend plays that game. He knows you. Maybe I should get on there next time. Another person is like, I wish somebody would ask me about the screenplay that I'm writing. Somebody else said, nobody ever asks me about my dog, and I miss her so much. The idea of curiosity has radically changed how I think about this work of sharing our faith and helping them to know Jesus. A part of my journey to understand how people come to know Jesus is that I looked to stories of people encountering Jesus in Scripture. Stories where people actually encountered Jesus and what happened in those moments. And one of the most powerful stories of someone encountering Jesus is the story of Jesus meeting the woman at the well, the story that Megan read for us. And for all of my hang-ups, one of the things that I know is that we still live under Jesus' mandate to go and make disciples of all nations. And so I want to invite you this morning, as fellow people under this mandate, as we work through this story, to listen to this story, because there's so much in this story about how to help others find and follow Jesus that I think can help us change how we think about the Great Commission. And so there's 4 things that I see in this story that have reframed my thinking about talking to others about Jesus. So getting into the story, beginning in verse 4, it says Jesus had to travel through Samaria, so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the property that Jacob had given his son Joseph. This is going back to the Old Testament. Jacob gave his son Joseph this plot of land. It says Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, worn out from his journey, sat down at the well. It was about noon. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. "Give me a drink," Jesus said to her, because his disciples had gone into the town to buy food. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" she asked him. For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So to give you a little bit of background on this and what's going on in the context here, Samaria was a region where a group of people known as Samaritans lived, and there was this strong divide between Jews and Samaritans. And in particular, it was an ethnic divide. It was an ethnic divide because Samaritans were people who were half Jewish and half Gentile. And so Jewish people tended to see them as sort of half-breeds and therefore as less than. And so they didn't often associate because of this ethnic divide. But then you take that a step further, given the fact that he was a man and she was a woman. And so there was much that would have gotten in the way of this conversation happening in the first place. But the first thing I see here is I see that Jesus is most concerned about being present to this woman. His highest concern is not the culturally formed biases that he ought to have against her that should prevent this conversation. Jesus is first and foremost interested in the human being in front of him, connecting with her as one person to another. You know, it seems today that one of the greatest commodities that we have is having someone's attention. That you actually have someone's full focus and attention. And not only is this extremely rare, but I found in the moments where you actually have someone's full attention, it's also incredibly powerful. Right? When somebody's willing to give you their full attention, when there's so much demanding your attention, it also communicates value. It communicates priority. And Jesus is doing that in this moment. He's communicating the priority of this woman, the value of this woman, simply through being present to her. This may seem surprising to some of you, but one of the things that I often struggle with is my anticipation of social anxiety. Not just social anxiety, but the anticipation of being in a social environment. And I have this anticipation of, am I going to be too awkward? Am I going to connect with these people? Am I going to be welcoming? Am I going to be funny? All of these questions about this, that once I get in the context, when I get in the environment, I'm fine, but the anticipation of it can lead me at times to say, you know what, maybe we don't have to go. Maybe we don't need to go. But one of the things that I have found immensely freeing is coming to understand that the most meaningful and impactful thing that I can often do is just be genuinely interested in the person's life and story who is in front of me. And it's freeing because it takes the pressure off of how are they experiencing me? Or have I been impressive to them? Or how do they like me? Have I been too awkward? It takes the focus off of me because my focus, my presence is fully about being present to them. And I think that this is an incredible gift that we can simply give people as a communication of priority and value. The other thing that Jesus does here that I think is really interesting in being present to this woman is that Jesus doesn't come and present himself as the solution, but actually comes as the one in need. He is the one who needs a drink of water. And you think about how that changes one's posture to a conversation. I think a lot of times when we think about these conversations about sharing our faith with others, we come from this posture of, I've got the answers, I've got the solution. And not only that, but we are preparing for an argument. Right? Like, I've got to have all of the answers. I've got to be able to defend everything that I'm going to say. And so we kind of come in a posture of defensiveness and bowed up. And what we see with Jesus, and I think the question that Jesus would ask us is, are you preparing for an argument or are you preparing for a friendship? The story goes on, verse 10, Jesus answered, if you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would ask him, and he would give you living water. Sir, the woman said, you don't even have a bucket, and the well is deep. So where do you get this living water? You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock. Jesus said, everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again. But whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never get thirsty again. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water springing up in him for eternal life." "Sir," the woman said to him, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and come here to draw water." What's going on here is Jesus is taking this conversation to a metaphorical level, going from this conversation about drawing literal water from this well to this water that will satisfy thirst eternally. But what's missing in here, what we may miss in the language, is that this language of living water could also be understood by this woman as running water, as in a stream of moving water. And so she's still on the level of, where can I get this water that is running water that I won't ever have to thirst again. And so the second thing that I see Jesus' approach is radically specific to this individual, radically specific to this moment, to the environment that has been created at the well. And the reason I think that's important is I think a lot of times we take this story as a formula for evangelism. Or we come into every conversation and every situation with the same formula, regardless of the context. And it ends up falling empty. The way that this might get used, and it's not wrong, it's just a formula. But it might go something like this. You go to someone and you say, you go to the same thing for a sense of life over and over, but it does not satisfy. Wouldn't it be great if you had a source of life that is truly satisfying? I've got living water. And you think, out of context, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's not that that's wrong or that's not true, but I don't think that's what we are seeing here. That Jesus isn't developing a formula or using a formula. What we are seeing is a radically contextualized conversation. When you think about what we know of this story, we know that Jesus is literally worn out and in need for a drink of water. The woman is there to draw water, and Jesus has nothing to draw with. We know this woman makes this exhausting trip day after day. And so this isn't necessarily a contrived plan, as it is an organic connecting to this woman's lived life and pain. How do we enter these conversations out of a desire to connect deeply with their lived life and making Jesus make sense in their context with their specific pain versus trying to force something that won't make sense outside of their context? Continuing on, verse 16, Jesus says, "Go call your husband," he said to her, "and come back here." "I don't have a husband," she answered. "You have correctly said, 'I don't have a husband,'" Jesus said, "for you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." "Sir," the woman replied, "I see that you are a prophet." The third thing that I see here is I see Jesus speak to her pain. The reason I say that is there's many traditions that have read this part of the story as Jesus calling out her immorality, calling out her sin. And that Jesus is doing this because she must experience her felt guilt of her sin in order to recognize her need of a Savior. However, when you look at this story, there is no mention of sin. There is no mention of guilt or repentance. And it's not that those things aren't important, it's just not what this story seems to be about. Some scholars suggest that what is actually happening here is that Jesus was putting his finger on if not the greatest point of pain in her life. What I mean by that is, if you understand a little bit about sort of women's economic situations at this time, as well as divorce law, what you would understand is that a woman would have lived with her family, in particular under the economic provision of her father, until she got married. And at that point, she would then move under the economic responsibility of her husband. However, when it came to divorce, a man could simply divorce his wife by giving her a divorce paper, and she would have no recourse to contest it or to demand any financial care. And so a woman could find herself economically destitute with no recourse and nothing to do about it. And so what we see with this woman is that she had been through this devastatingly painful and uncertain, destabilizing experience 5 times. And finally had found a man who, though he wasn't willing to marry her, was willing to offer economic support for her. You can begin to feel how this would have been a severe source of pain. But on top of that, though we do not know the circumstances of her divorce and divorces, the specific details of those would not have mattered from a societal standpoint because she still would have been seen as immoral simply because these men had put her aside. You can begin to feel how this would have been very painful, and yet Jesus was putting his finger on this and acknowledging this. And I think for so many people today, our pain is just below the surface. And I'm wondering, how does it change these relationships when we shift from the focus being, how do I get them to believe what I believe, to how can I help them hold their pain? How can I help them process their pain? It's not that it's not important what they believe, but I think if our desire is to get there, we need to begin with the place of speaking to their pain, of helping hold their pain. I think right now in our world, there's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of uncertainty about what the future holds. Maybe financially, you're in a place of uncertainty. Career-wise, uncertainty. Maybe not everyone here feels that, but maybe you're feeling some fears. I think a lot of people are feeling that, and this is a space for us as God's people to step in, to be a place that can help to hold that fear, those uncertainties, that pain. Continuing in verse 20, she says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say the place to worship is in Jerusalem." I want to pause here because at least since the Reformation, this question of hers about what is the proper place to worship has often been read as an attempt to change the subject. That what she's trying to do here is to change the subject from this intensely personal conversation about her life to more religious things that are less personal. But I don't think that's what's happening here at all. The fourth thing that I see is I see that Jesus being present to her created space for her to ask her own questions. I think what's happening here is that this was a deeply serious question for her. Where is the proper place to worship? I know what my people say, but learning that this was a prophet, this was her chance to ask, what do you say? What do you think? And I think what's so interesting about this, what's so powerful about this is we could make all kinds of assumptions about this woman, about her morality or immorality, about what she cares about, what she's interested in. And those assumptions have been made both in her day as well as in commentaries and theologians since then. But I think one of the assumptions that we might make about her is that she would have no interest in spiritual or religious things. And yet what we discover is that couldn't be farther from the truth. That she was deeply interested in and jumped at her first chance to explore these questions with someone who was also clearly interested in these conversations. I think this is an assumption many of us make all the time when we look at the people in our lives, that they would have no interest in talking about these things. And yet, as skeptical as folks may be of the church and faith and religion, the truth is that doesn't remove the fact that people still have to face the big questions of life. The questions of meaning, the questions of fulfillment, the questions of hope, the questions of mortality. These are inescapable questions. The Barna Research Group did some studies, and they record them in this book called Faith for the Curious, which has been just a fantastic read that I would encourage you to pick up in addition to the Sent book. But one of the questions that they ask is, when you consider your spiritual beliefs, what would you say you are looking for? And they divide their answers by those who would consider themselves Christians, people of other faiths, and people of no faith. And 30% of people who said they had no faith said they were still seeking inner peace in their spiritual journeys. 24% of people who said they had no faith were still seeking hope in their spiritual journeys. 23% of people who said they had no faith were still seeking truth in their spiritual journeys. In other words, I think people are still interested in these questions and in these conversations. And so when we create a safe enough space by communicating our care for their pain, and they know that we too are spiritually curious and religious people, it creates the space for them to bring their own questions. Jesus responds to her question. Verse 21, Jesus told her, "Believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know because salvation is from the Jews." Referring specifically to Jesus. "But an hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship with the Father in spirit and in truth. Yes, the Father wants such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Jesus told her, "I, the one speaking to you, am he." When I look at this story, I think the best word to describe Jesus' posture to this woman was curiosity. Loving curiosity. Jesus was present to her. He was genuinely interested in her life, her questions. And where all of this led was to meaningful conversation about Jesus and who he himself is. And it wasn't because of a formula that was contrived for such outcomes, but because he was genuinely curious and interested in her as a human being with her own pain and her own story. One of the things that she says she knows that the Messiah is coming who will explain everything to us. And what we see is Jesus does that. He explains things about her that there's no other way he could know. She is led to this place of a confession, ultimately, of who he is. But the other great thing about curiosity is that curiosity also means that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to go in having a bunch of answers already prepared. In fact, curiosity is a great way to explore these conversations together. I hate debating. And so that also creates a lot in me that doesn't want to have these conversations because I hate ending up in debates. But genuine curiosity removes conversations from a debate to exploration. And so this is why we are offering this resource that Sharon talked about earlier of this Alpha course, is that this course is actually organized around questions. And so as you think about your one, the one that we invited you at the beginning of the year to begin to think about and pray about, who in your life has God brought to you? Or who has God placed in your life that maybe needs to hear more about Jesus? When you begin to have more meaningful conversations with that person and questions come up, our intent would be that you could say, these are really great questions. And truth be told, I don't know all of the answers. But my church is offering this class where we come together around a meal and explore these questions together. Would you want to join me in this meal? We want to create that option for you so that you're not walking this road alone, that you're not doing this in your own power and ability. So the place that I want us to end is that this kind of work can leave us feeling like it's all on us. The pressure is on us. And I want to just bring us back to the place where Alex brought us last week, the place that I think is so important for us to keep in mind throughout all of this, which is to our place of dependence on God and His Spirit in this work. I shared about just how freeing it is to simply focus on being present to people. But at that moment, I also asked God's Spirit what it means to be present to this person, to help me stay focused on this person, to be present to them in meaningful ways to them. And what I want you to know is that if you have God's Spirit with you, you have everything that you need to have these conversations. I want to give us a moment just to bring this to God. I want to invite you to bow your head. I'm going to have our prayer team come forward. They'll be available, but maybe this just feels daunting. I want you to be reminded that you're not doing this work alone, and in fact, can be a rich and powerful gift to those around us. Jesus, we thank you for your example in this story of how to be present to people. God, how to be genuinely interested in the lives of others as a sign of radical love in an age where we can be so consumed with our own lives. God, would your Spirit give us the courage to look above our own lives, to lift our gaze, to see the people that you've placed in our lives that need to hear this message of hope and life and peace. Jesus, we depend on you.